The king's sharpened blade lay gleaming and spotless, ready to strike in lands beyond the sea. The ravens cried out for a feast, and wolves let out haunting howls from far-off hills. Deep in the woods, the local peasants caught sight of a man they feared and remembered. It was the exiled King Olaf, who had returned from the realm of the Rus to reclaim the crown of Norway. By his side stood his half-brother, the powerful young Harald Sigurdsson, just 15 years old. Along the way, drifters and wanderers joined their growing army, and the group camped on a small rise known as Stiklestad. Soon they heard the noise of an oncoming force, led by a former ally of Olaf, Kalf Arnason. Now Kalf fought for the new ruler, King Knut the Great, who controlled Denmark, England and Norway itself. Cries to Christ rang out, as did shouts to Odin, and both sides clashed in a violent storm of war. Olaf's side was quickly overwhelmed. Scattered limbs and lifeless bodies turned the hill red and slippery. A soldier's blade cut into young Harald, and King Olaf was struck down with a spear. As Norse tales later told, Olaf fell against a rock, and as he gripped the weapon lodged in his belly, he looked to the heavens and called out to God. It was then that Kalf Arnason stepped forward and slashed Olaf's throat. Panic spread and Olaf's troops fled. Kalf and his men moved through the battlefield, putting wounded enemies to death. Bleeding and bruised, Harald stood again and stumbled into the woods. He pushed through the forest until he came upon a small home where a kind peasant family welcomed him and cared for his injuries by the fire. Harald remained with them for a short while, but time was against him. The bitter black winter would soon close off the mountain trails heading east. So, wrapping himself in a red cloak, he followed the peasant's son into the mountains. Straying far from any well-known road, the determined young prince trekked across lonely peaks, always steering clear of bandit camps. He wandered through ancient forests where old legends spoke of trolls and giants. At last, Harald reached Sweden. There he found others who had survived the bloodshed at Stiklestad. He spent the winter there, gathered loyal companions, and left the northern lands behind. Harald and his band sailed in dragon-headed ships past quiet wooden villages and small churches. Long ago, their ancestors had come to this Rus land to raid and destroy. The Viking Age had begun some 200 years earlier, when Norse warriors gathered the fiercest sons of Odin to burn towns, steal riches, and capture people along the shores of Europe. But many of those Norse also made homes here, joining with local Slavs and Finns to build a vast kingdom called Kievan Rus. Back in Scandinavia, the days of the old gods and scattered clans were fading. Olaf and Knut had taken the Christian faith and crowned themselves kings, waging war on the pagan chieftains who still clung to the old ways. Yet Odin's black raven still flew on some banners, and Norse axes remained feared everywhere. In Rus, Harald and his men found work as hired swords. When they reached the grand cities of Novgorod and Kiev, they were welcomed into the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Harald told him the sad news of Olaf's death. Yaroslav had once given Olaf shelter during his exile. Also in that royal hall were Olaf's former mistress and his illegitimate son Magnus. Yaroslav received Harald warmly and sent him to fight against enemies in the marshlands of Poland. There, Harald and his warriors destroyed towns and killed enemy fighters, earning both fame and fortune. Over time, Harald built a name for himself and asked for Yaroslav's daughter, the young princess Elisaveta, to be his wife. But Yaroslav refused. Harald was still only around 18, a fearless yet landless officer without gold or a crown. Then in 1034, 2 more Norwegians arrived in the land of the Rus. They were Einar Tambarskjalfir, a heavy-set rival of Olaf, and Kalf Arnason, the man who had taken Olaf's life. King Knut's grip on Norway was weakening, and these men came to find a new ruler. But instead of choosing Harald, bold and ambitious, they selected the child Magnus, easy to guide and control. Harald lacked the troops and wealth to fight these powerful foes for the throne he longed to hold. Yet he had heard tales of distant kingdoms filled with treasures waiting to be taken by force. So, with a few hundred loyal men, he sailed south. The sunlight glinted off high crosses and domed rooftops, falling into narrow alleys and shadowy streets. Centuries ago, when Rome collapsed under the weight of barbarian raids, this city kept the Roman flame alive. This was Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Harald walked its streets. The markets rang with voices from faraway lands, and the alleys echoed with the cries of the poor and the laughter of brothels. He approached the palace and enlisted in the Varangian Guard, the legendary group of Norse warriors trusted by the Byzantines as protectors and elite soldiers. These Varangians guarded the imperial throne itself, where Emperor Michael IV now sat beside Empress Zoe, over 30 years older than him. Not long before, Michael had been a man of low birth, just Zoe's lover. Rumors said they had arranged the death of her husband, Emperor Romanos III, and married on the same day he was killed. Harald was quickly sent to war, for the empire was in danger. The Islamic Fatimid dynasty ruled the Holy Land and much of the southern seas. Lately, pirates from Islamic Sicily and Tunisia had begun raiding Christian lands, stealing children and women and killing the men. Emperor Michael sent his fleet to stop them. Byzantine ships chased the pirates and fired burning Greek fire. Many pirates died in the flames, others tried to fight back, only to face Harald and his axe-wielding Norsemen. The Varangians boarded ships and slaughtered enemies hand to hand. Then they joined land campaigns to seize towns held by Muslims along the empire's edge. The Fatimids struck back, slaughtering Christian villages, but peace was finally agreed upon. The terms allowed Christians to rebuild the sacred Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a church once torn down by a former caliph who had, for a time, forced Christians to embrace Islam. It is said Harald joined the emperor's embassy on a long journey through dry deserts until they reached Jerusalem. The Byzantine men visited the holy places, walked the paths of Christ's suffering, and Harald used his axe to cut down thieves who followed their caravan. He later bathed in the river Jordan. Now a man in his 20s, Harald rose to lead the Varangians with harsh discipline. He marched into Islamic Sicily with the Byzantines and helped break a siege by digging under the city walls with his men and killing the defenders. In every fight, Harald took treasures and grew his wealth. Still, unrest troubled the empire. Though prayers echoed in golden churches, fear spread. The emperor's health was failing, his body bloated, and he suffered fits. Before death, he adopted his nephew Michael and named him heir. Some distrusted this younger Michael. One monk warned he wore a smile over a devious mind, clever at trickery. But Emperor Michael IV still breathed and called Harald to ride with him in one last campaign to crush a rebellion among the Bulgars. Together they destroyed rebel towns, captured the rebel king whose eyes were gouged out and nose cut off, and returned to Constantinople in triumph. The streets rang with cheers for Harald, now nicknamed the Burner of the Bulgars, while the sickly emperor barely stayed upright on his horse. He died not long after. His adopted son was declared Emperor Michael V, and the once glorious court turned into a corrupt circle of flatterers, all caught in the emperor's paranoia. Michael V sent men to kill Harald, but the Viking and his Varangian warriors fought back and eliminated the assassins. Michael V also didn't trust Zoe. In fact, he had once considered marrying his adoptive mother, but by now she was over 60 and could not give him an heir. He had Zoe taken into custody, quickly tried her for allegedly trying to poison him, and as records say, he had the audacity to cut off Zoe's hair like she was a mere prostitute and had her chained and exiled to an island where she was forced to live as a nun. The people were furious. Crowds gathered around the grand palaces, shouting in anger. Michael Five hid in his quarters, tormented by their cries of loyalty toward Zoe. He agreed to bring her back and made the captive empress plead with the public to accept him as ruler, but the people didn't fall for the act. Masses charged into the palace and Harald, along with his warriors, joined the revolt. They slaughtered the palace guards, broke into the royal chambers, and the mobs looted gold, precious fabrics, and silk. Michael V was discovered hiding in a monastery, his head shaved in the fashion of monks. He begged to be allowed to become a monk and step away from the throne. But the people weren't moved by his plea. They dragged him from the altar all the way to Constantinople's city walls. According to the Norse tales, it was Harald of Norway who answered the crowd's demand for vengeance. He grabbed the trembling, screaming Michael Viv and used his dagger to blind him. The emperor screamed in pain and bled in front of the Viking. Michael was then said to have been castrated. After that, he was sent back to a monastery, where he died within months. Eventually, Zoe was brought back to the throne. Some believed she still carried feelings for Harald, but Zoe married another man, someone over 20 years younger than her. If Harald had stained his blade with royal blood, there were more kings still to fight. For the throne of Norway was held by the illegitimate son of Harald's late brother, and traitors stood beside him as counselors. Harald would seek revenge. Around 1044, as winter snow crept across the north, King Magnus of Norway launched attacks on Denmark, bringing fire and destruction. Servants fled from their masters' burning homes. Men were killed in front of their families, and women and children were taken as spoils. The attackers searched for the rebel leader Svein, who had been made king by the Danes in defiance of King Magnus's rule. After the death of Knut the Great and later his son, Magnus had claimed rights to both the English and Danish thrones. He chose not to pursue England, but now confirmed his hold on Denmark through fire and blood. Svein's troops were scattered, lying dead in icy waters or hiding in dark woods. Svein found safety in the friendly court of the Swedish king. Magnus the Good was celebrated as the rightful king of both Norway and Denmark. After his father, the devout Christian king Olaf, died, many claimed post-death miracles surrounded him, and he was honored as a saint. Magnus's armies were mighty, and his rule was seen as both sacred and powerful, leaving few brave enough to challenge him. But across the sea came a howling wind and a strange ship. A Viking who had once been exiled from these lands returned. He was the uncle of Magnus, brother to Saint Olaf, the seasoned warrior Harald Sigurdsson, now back to claim Norway's crown. He stayed at the Swedish royal court, where he displayed strange and endless riches. Around 15 years had passed since he had fled Scandinavia after the death of his brother Olaf. Since then, he had won fame and wealth, serving as a warrior for rulers in the land of the Rus and the Byzantine Empire. That fall, while Magnus and his forces were near the coast, they were surprised by the arrival of Harald's grand ship. King Magnus greeted his uncle cautiously. The Grand Prince of Kiev had recently promised his beautiful daughter Elisaveta to Harald. It was now clear that Harald not only had a royal wife and huge wealth, but also a blood claim to the throne. Harald asked Magnus how they should share the rule of Norway. Magnus replied that he had to ask his advisors first. One advisor, an old foe of Olaf named Einar Tambarskjolfir, spoke firmly, "We don't want two kings, we've always had one, and we will continue to serve only King Magnus as long as he reigns." Ashamed, Harald returned to Sweden. If they would not accept him as king, they would face him as a warrior. Longships crashed onto shores, and Norsemen stormed the land under the flags of Svein and Harald. The two had made a pact. Svein would take Denmark, and Harald would seize Norway. Villages were set ablaze. Men were slain, women dragged from their homes. As one poem described, "Few escaped with tales to tell, for sorrow broke the people's will. The only captives from the field were lovely girls taken to be held. And in wild fear to the sea were driven chained maidens fair to see, their pale arms wounded by the chains, their soft cries lost among the flames." News of war reached Magnus, and his advisors believed it would be unwise to fight Harald directly. So secret messages were exchanged between the two, and they negotiated to share the rule of Norway. Svein felt betrayed and tried to murder Harald in his sleep. But Harald survived and was soon crowned King Harald III of Norway. Still, Magnus insisted on being the senior king, with top honors in rituals and court matters. Magnus was loved by the people for his kindness and generosity, which Harald saw as weak and immature. The two insulted one another openly. Yet a bigger threat pushed them to unite again. Together they marched against Svein in Denmark. In the autumn of 1047, Magnus became seriously ill. As his strength faded, he declared that Harald should rule Norway alone and that Denmark should go to Svein. Magnus the Good soon passed away, but Harald didn't feel bound by the words of a dying man. He quickly made plans to take Denmark for himself. However, during the king's assembly, Einar announced that he would return to bury Magnus in Norway and that he would rather serve the late king than any living ruler. Einar had many loyal fighters and held great influence, so Harald had no choice but to hold back and focus on taking control of Norway. The great thrones of the north had not yet destroyed the power of the Viking clans. Kings still had to deal with the ancient warrior families of each region. Svein was declared king of the Danes, and when Harald attacked Denmark during the summer, Svein managed to escape. Harald went back to Norway and took a second wife, Thora of the powerful Arneson family. While his wives gave him children to become future heirs, Harald's focus shifted again to the south. In 1050, he launched another brutal raid into Denmark. His Vikings swept across farms, burned towns, and set churches ablaze. People were tortured to death, women were violated, and the trading hub of Hedeby was destroyed. When Svein finally brought a massive army against him, Harald ran. Back in Norway, Harald began hunting down and killing those who questioned his rule. But Einar led a strong group of chieftains who openly opposed Harald's violent ways. Eventually, Harald requested a private meeting with Einar to resolve their differences. Einar entered the king's dark chamber and commented on the shadows. Suddenly, a few of Harald's men came out of hiding and killed him. Einar's son rushed in to help his father, but they murdered him too. The people began to hate King Harald, and soon whispers of rebellion spread among the farmers. The king ordered his trusted ally Finn Arneson to approach the enemy and ask for peace. But Finn asked the king to give something in return for such a dangerous task. He wanted his brother Kalf to be brought back safely. Kalf Arneson had been the worst traitor to King Harald's family. Some even said that he was the one who had killed Olaf himself. When Magnus found out about this crime years before, Kalf ran away and hid in the Norwegian-held areas along the northern parts of Scotland. But now Harald welcomed him back to Norway and returned his former lands to him. That summer, King Harald launched a military campaign in Denmark and ordered Kalf to lead the first attack on the Danish forces. After Kalf and his men were overwhelmed and killed, Harald landed with backup forces. Everyone, including Finn, clearly saw the betrayal of their king, who seemed to want revenge. Harald later wrote with pride that he had delivered the final blow to 2 more of his enemies. He burned towns and looted lands where loyalty was uncertain, and there were whispers that he had even taken offerings that had been left by worshippers at St. Olaf's grave. Even though he built large churches and the kingdom appeared to flourish on the outside, people in the years ahead would come to know him by the name Hardrada, meaning the harsh ruler. For many years he spilled the blood of countless enemies, yet the hated King Svein of Denmark still remained. Harald led 150 longships to the south, raiding coastlines that belonged to the Danes in those days. Then, near the river Nisa, his men spotted a fleet twice the size of theirs. Svein had arrived to answer Harald's call for war. In this part of the world, the late summer sun stays in the sky for a long time, and even in the darkest hours, the horizon glows with fading light. In this eerie twilight, Harald rallied his warriors for battle. Both fleets were tied together with ropes and chains to keep their formations, and then they clashed. Arrows and spears flew into shields, chests, and heads. Norwegian ships that weren't tied down moved around and flanked the Danes, leading to brutal fighting on the decks. Many Danes threw themselves into the water, and Harald captured 70 of their ships. In the blood-stained sea, his fighters captured Finn Arneson alive, the same man who had turned against Harald to serve Svein. Harald chose not to kill him. Still, King Svein had managed to flee the battle and gather his forces once more. The fighting had drained both kingdoms, and within 2 years Harald made peace with Svein without any conditions. Harald stayed in Norway, content to rule through fear and violence, punishing areas that resisted him. In doing so, he created a form of peace by spreading terror.